Welcome to the webinar. I hope you're doing well wherever you're joining us from the world. Our webinar today, Rethinking the Eco-Social Contract, is the first in a series organized by the Global Research and Action Network for a new eco-social contract. My name is Najma Mohammed. I'm Policy Director of the Green Economy Coalition, and I'll be the moderator for our webinar today. Greetings. I already see that people are saying hello in the chat. So partnering with the UN Research Institute for Social Development, UNRIS, we bring you this webinar today, where we really, the first, we hope, of many of the research and action network that we put together. And the network really offers a space for dialogue, for debate, for co-construction and action around the meaning of a new eco-social contract. What are the good practices for its design, and what are the mechanisms for its application? The time has come to replace the broken social contract and to create a new one geared to greater inclusion and sustainability. So these were the words of the UN Secretary General in 2020 on the occasion of Mandela Day. As a South African, you can imagine a day that's very close to my heart. And so more than 2 years later, as the world starts to emerge rather unevenly from the ravage of the COVID-19 pandemic, many across the world have called for a new green and social contract, one that would rebuild trust between citizens and people in power, and one that restores our relationship with nature. Disparate voices from the anti-racism movement, climate justice, labor rights, gender justice, and indigenous peoples movements are calling for a new eco-social contract. So in the webinar today, I'm incredibly excited, joined by a fantastic panel here today to talk about what is the thinking behind eco-social contracts. What are the new ideas, old ideas and concepts that we can draw on to start thinking about this relationship between people and the planet? And how can we revive an eco-social contract? We're going to hear stories from different parts of the world. I'm happy to see all the activity in the chat. So I want to take a few minutes just to introduce the panel and share with you a few house rules for our webinar today. I'm really pleased to be joined with Manisha Desai, who is a Senior Research Fellow at UNRIS. Manisha, it's wonderful having you here. I had the privilege of having a look at the paper that you're going to be sharing with us today, and I absolutely love reading it, and I'm sure that the audience is going to really enjoy engaging with the ideas that you've put forward. Manisha is a professor of sociology, and her areas of research and teaching include transnational feminisms, gender and globalization, human rights, and contemporary Indian society. And today she'll be speaking about communitarian imaginaries as inspirations for rethinking about the eco-social contract. Welcome, Manisha. Very happy to have you here. Joining us from Peru is a good colleague and friend of mine, Luis Miguel Prado from Libelula. Luis Miguel will share with us how we advocate, how his organization was part of an alliance that advocated successfully to change the law to enable and recognize small green business development in Peru. Luis Miguel is the executive producer in the communications department at Libelula. His work focuses on connecting people and organizations to improve the way they interact with the environment. And he currently leads the work of the Green Economy Coalition in Peru, where he congregates a community of green MSMEs. Janus Krusman, very happy to have you here with us. Janus, I've been given your age in your bio, which is, I think, very important to share so that we can take inspiration for a young person who's taken that kind of action that you have. But Janus is a 20-year-old climate activist and law student at the University of Bonn in Germany. He started organizing protests with Fridays for Future in Constance in early 2019, convincing his city council to declare a local climate emergency in May 2019. which is the first German city to do so. And Janus is also with 3 other young people in Germany, suing the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in a constitutional complaint for its insufficient climate action, supported by a German NGO. Very wonderful to have all 3 of you and looking forward to a great conversation. So before we hand over to you, Manisha, it's wonderful to see the chat. As you can see, our webinar today, we've got the chat functions for you to say hello, share your work with us, tell us where you're calling in from, and if you see friends and colleagues on the call, please do use the chat to reach out and connect. The session will be live streamed via the UNRWA's YouTube channel, and it will remain there afterwards. So if you want to share with colleagues, please do so afterwards. We've enabled both the chat and the Q&A function. So we use the chat for all our social interactions, to say hello, to share our work, and the Q&A, where we will share any questions to the panelists. And we also have in the Q&A the function to vote for a question. So if there's a particular question you like and you'd like us to answer first, please vote for that question so that we can deal with that one first. This is an incredible network that we are part of, and so we do remind you that we keep the language used in the chat respectful of all participants, refraining from any discriminatory or demeaning speech. And then finally, after the webinar concludes, we'll share a very short feedback survey, and we would greatly appreciate if you could tell us how the webinar went and how we can, improve in future ones. So Manisha, I'm going to hand over to you first, and I know we're going to get your screen being shared, but I would like to say from my personal perspective, what a pleasure it was to read the paper, to understand, that within the existing narratives and imaginaries about how human beings relate to the environment, we often find, very dominant perspectives. And I related so much because I know when I started my career in the environment sector more than 20 years ago, giving away my age, I did struggle to find the kind of imaginary and narrative that really is about the I and we, because I come from a particular narrative that is very much, integrated with nature, and I found it hard to find my tribe, find my intellectual tribe as well. And so I'm really, really looking forward to your presentation, Manisha, and over to you.
Thanks, Najma, and thanks everyone for organizing this and inviting me to present my paper. But first, I want to wish everybody good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. But also start by acknowledging the land where I am and where University of Connecticut is based and where we work from. And so we usually gather in the territory of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, the Saukticoke, as well as Golden Hill, Pagasetat, Nipmuc, and Lenape people who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land, and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And I think it's always appropriate to acknowledge land, but I think particularly for the webinar that we have today, talking about imaginaries and the eco-social contract. And I think without acknowledging the land on which all of us sit and stand and work, I think it's hard. So I just wanted to start with that. And if I could have the slides, please. Thank you. And if you could go to the next one. And so the next slide, please. What I've done here is really present to you alternative ways in which people throughout centuries have thought about their relationship with land, with other human beings, and also with other species. I think we very often place ourselves outside nature, but we are animals and we are part of nature. And I think it's important for us to re-embed ourselves in nature. And so the purpose of this presentation was to look at some communitarian imaginaries and the ways in which they've conceptualized this relationship between people and other living species, and between people and other even non-living entities. And so I sort of, start with this 2 understandings of communitarianism, and there in itself we can kind of see, and I usually don't like to think in terms of binaries because I think binaries very often hide more than they reveal. But in this instance, I think it is important. The first definition up there of communitarianism is really from the Confederation of the National Indigenous People of Ecuador. And there, the communitarianism has to do with the territory, the political, cultural, and economic life models, right? And if you see the second quote, it's from Amitai Etzioni, who's a very well-known scholar of communitarianism, but liberal communitarianism. And there you see that most of the focus on that communitarianism is about individual rights in relationship to other people. And so the rest of nature, economy, politics really doesn't appear in that. And I think it's important to recognize that even communitarianism has different connotations. And so I kind of wanted to start with that. So when I'm talking about communitarianism, I'm drawing from different sources of communitarian thinking. And as you'll see, I'm going to focus today on just 3 examples because I have 15 minutes and I want to be able to do at least justice to those 3. But I'm sure there are others that we can talk about. So the 3 that I'm going to talk about, the next slide, please, are Ubuntu, which of course Najma would be familiar to you as coming from South Africa, but it's not just South African, it's also in lots of Southern and Eastern African regions. I'm then going to talk about eco-Swaraj that has come from a lot of ecological movements in India. And finally, I'm also going to talk about Sumak Kwase, which comes from indigenous communities in Latin America. And I'll start with Ubuntu. And I think one of the biggest, interesting, important notion in Ubuntu, which as I've mentioned that is in a lot of different languages, is the notion of togetherness of the individual and community and how those two are co-constituted. Right? So when I put up the earlier communitarian quote from Etzioni in terms of Western liberal philosophy, the relationship is between the individual and the community, where the two are seen as somehow separate. Here, the individual and the community are co-constituent and are in relation not only to each other, but also to ancestors, to the God above, but to humans and other species and entities on Earth. And so it's a much more capacious understanding of communitarianism and the relationships which we have with this. And what are those relationships? And the very premise or the core of those relationships are of mutual respect, of generosity and harmony. But most importantly, I think for our age, and this is what I want to highlight, which I think is true of the others as well, is that these relationships don't just appear. They have to be cultivated and they have to be evident in social organizing, which means that, our economic, political, and social organization have to reflect those values. And in some ways, that's kind of what the focus of the new eco-social contract is, that we cannot have a new social contract, eco-social contract, if we start with the same institutions, that we really need a whole revamping of the way in which our societies are organized. And so that's kind of, to give you a quick sense of where Ubuntu starts with. The next slide, please. The second sort of imaginary that I want to talk about is eco-Swaraj, and that was defined by Ashish Katari, who's a well-known activist in India and has been working on ecological issues for generations. And his conception comes not from any specific indigenous tradition in India per se, but it comes from the long history of social movements, particularly in the last 30 years, around what it means to really fight for ecological rights. And here in eco-Swaraj, what is highlighted is self-determination and sufficiency. And that is what Swaraj is, literally means self-rule, or it also means self-determination. And of course, Swaraj also has its long history from India's independence struggle against the British, when Gandhiji, conceptualized the notion of Swaraj as Swaraj of independence from the British. So it also has a longer history in Indian political struggle. And in eco-Swaraj, what is interesting is that it starts with nature and conceives of the human self as relational in multiple dimensions. That is, that the relationships you have with nature are not just, in terms of physical, that is, we walk in nature, we use them, kind of extractive, but also relationships that are intellectual, that are social, that are cultural, the ways in which we relate, through songs, through poetry, to dance. So our relationships with nature then are at multiple levels. And given its origins and struggle for equity and justice, particularly around land rights, gender, and ecological sustainability, those kind of rights are central to the conception. So here, we do see kind of, what Raven O'Connell, who's a well-known sociologist, talks about solidarity of epistemologies, that instead of, kind of the binary of what comes from the global north or the south, you see that, Ashish in his conception does bring in human rights and kind of, work with what we see from, the systems that we see are broken and need to be fixed, but then also kind of looking at movements and the way in which they conceptualize that. Central to eco-Swaraj is also local democratic decision-making, and hence his conception is also very similar to what Vandana Shiva has called earth democracy, right? Or a radical ecological democracy. And so those are kind of central to this communitarian vision of the eco-Swaraj. And along with eco-Swaraj, given that there are lots of ways in which people are drawing upon their traditions, there's also been a way in which recently, and of course this, given the Indian context and the rise of Hindutva, is problematic to kind of draw from those older traditions. But at the same time, you cannot sort of give up traditions just to the Hindutva people. We kind of need to, also look at the various traditions in different perspectives. And so we also have people working around the notion, which comes from Upanishads, which are, a long series of texts and deliberations that come from the Brahminic or the Hindu tradition. And that one particularly is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means that the whole world is a family. And that means that if you're a family, then what are the relationships? What do we owe the other? And so those are conceptions that people are also working with in India, kind of bringing together long-standing, conceptions from the Vedas and the Upanishads, which are Sanskrit texts, which, have been around for around 1500 to, years. And so that's also some of the ways in which you have new conceptions merging with older ones. Next slide, please. And finally, I also want to talk about Tsumakase, which is living in harmony or life in plenty, which comes particularly from Quechua-speaking indigenous communities of Bolivia and Ecuador. And here again, the premise on the communitarian quote that I had early on comes from the indigenous communities in Ecuador. And they're the kind of, basis of all these relationships of living in harmony with nature and with each other are egalitarianism, reciprocity, and communitarian principles in relation to land, which means not private property, that one cannot really own land, that land, none of us owns land, land is there, that we are stewards of the land, that we take care of the land. And so it's a very place-based conception, but it's also a very dynamic conception. And I think that's kind of what I want to highlight, that even as we look back to certain communitarian imaginaries, these are not static imaginaries, that they have changed in relation to what they have encountered historically, whether it's genocide, colonialism, post-colonialism, and now neoliberal globalization, that these communitarian imaginaries have evolved in response to all of these entities as well. And so they're not something static that we go back to, right? But also what's very important to, I think, remember, and I can address that a little more during the Q&A, is that this Tsumakase was really for the struggle for autonomy and self-determination. And so it emerges from a decolonial project in Latin America, and it's not primarily an ecological conception. And the reason I want to highlight that is that it has been translated again in Spanish as Buen Vivir, and it's kind of made it, it's almost something that it's become a buzzword, like a lot of things. But very often people don't realize that as a decolonial project, it means certain things. It means autonomy of land. It means things that we're not kind of willing yet to think about, even in the new eco-social contract, right? And so it cannot be deterritorialized, and it cannot be just appropriated. And that's kind of a caution for all three of these imaginaries, right? That they come from specific context. They've been historically evolving, but nonetheless, there has been a dynamic relationship and conversation within those specific histories, and that we need to keep that in mind. And so finally, by way of kind of concluding, if you could go to the next slide, please. That what does, and I sort of talk here about the roti-based thinking, and roti, for those of you who are, not from my part of the world, roti is an Indian flatbread, which is the staple for most people. And this I borrow from Gabriel Dietrich, who's a wonderful scholar activist in India, originally from Germany, and decades ago, in kind of critiquing the notion of economic growth as the only basis, through which development could occur. She kind of critiqued the whole notion of, expanding the pie, which was always the economic term that we use. Let's expand the pie so more people can have it. And she said to think about pie in a context where most people can't even eat rotis itself is problematic. And what I want to draw from there is that our metaphors are important. The language that we use and the metaphors, that if you're talking about a global context in which we have a true diversities of languages, peoples, cultures, then the hegemony of particular languages, particularly English, and I am part of that, the one communicating to you all in English. But how do we go beyond that hegemony? How do we think about language and metaphors, right, that come from different parts of the world, because they carry with them different philosophies, they carry with them different cosmologies, which help us to rethink through. So I think all three of those imaginaries tell us to be mindful of language, and also to be mindful not of appropriation, because as Gayatri Spivak says, very often these days when we all want to sort of, be mindful of the ways in which other communities have been excluded, we sometimes include them through what she calls epistemic violence. That is, we take their ideas, bring it in, but kind of decontextualize them. And we, of course, never visibilize the people whose ideas are there. We kind of appropriate and speak for them. And so we need to be mindful of that as well when we talk about language and metaphors from elsewhere. How do we do that? The second important thing is that scale matters, that we, even as we think about eco-social contract globally, and we're about to, talk about launching a global network, how do we think at different scales so that it's not, this kind of Russian doll phenomenon of scale from the local to the regional, to the national, to the global, but kind of scales at even maybe a horizontal level. So what Apadura and others have talked about, translocality, so that we can have relationships across locals in different places, not just centering nation, because transnational again centers nation and the nation state. And that's another thing that almost all of the three communitarian imaginaries have, is how do we decenter the nation state? And of course, that's a huge question and not easy at all, given that that's the construction we have right now in terms of even, the United Nations is an intergovernmental body which recognizes, autonomy and nation state level. So what does that look like? Second, ontology as the basis of epistemology, which means who we are and our relationship to others, and how can that begin to develop notions that we have about different ideas of our notions and our different theories about the ways we think about our link to others and to land. And finally, the relational self in harmony with other communities and other species and entities, that we cannot be in some ways very human-centric. And very often in the humanities, we talk now about post-humanities, that we need to go beyond just humanities to thinking about all entities, kind of a more planetary thinking in which we are just one part and there are other species and other entities. And so I think if we want to kind of move towards a roti-based rethinking, a new eco-social contract, then I think these are some of the things that the three, communitarian imaginaries that I sort of had to go to very quickly kind of, gesture towards, that we need to keep in mind. And these are, of course, very challenging issues and questions, but I think we are in challenging times. And so we need to really think about radical ways of redefining and reorganizing, most importantly, where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha. That's great timing. I see there's two questions in the chat to kick us off already. I mean, as you said, it's a work in progress. I really enjoyed the paper, and I'm very excited for it to come out, as one of the sort of first, thought pieces at the beginning. There's a very interesting question in the Q&A section, actually, about the need for new institutions to implement, the ideas, and how this network can be established and nurtured to implement the ideas harvested from this webinar. And what really struck me from your paper, and I will share with us, I know everyone hasn't had it as you, and I think it's important for those of us who are part of the network. You speak about the, eco-social contract, and we had a huge discussion about that, by the way. Do we have to add eco to the social contract? Do we really just want this idea of a social contract to have the ecological consciousness, embedded within it? That you don't have to add the ego for it to be about our relationship with one another and with nature. And I know, I mean, having worked in the sector for many, many years, we always think we add green or we add eco so we can give it prominence so that it's not missing, because it is missing from so many, of our, philosophies and approaches within society. So, we'd love, your advice on just how we can proceed as a network, pretty much as the question that was asked. And then a very interesting one, which I'd love to hear from, even if anyone in the audience would like to add, do we have any communitarian conceptions from Europe or the industrialized world? I mean, these were very particular places that you that you brought in. So Manisha, over to you to respond.
Sure. So in terms of, I'll start with the second one, because of course we do have communitarian imaginaries from Europe as well. And when we think about the commons, I think that comes, from a very English and then later on European basis. I think similarly we have in Eastern Europe as well, in Southern Europe, and very often, in the North-South binaries, we kind of forget the East-West relationship, which was so central during Cold War eras, and now we've moved on. But we then kind of, the second world gets invisibilized in some ways. But I think, yes, of course, there are, conceptions that are similar. And I think just the whole notion of the commons comes from there. So I think that's just one example. And I think your earlier, the question, which I'm not sure that it was a question, but more a statement that I agree with, which is that, yes, we do need new institutions. And that means, how do we practice? Where do we start with, right? And what are the kind of linkages and relationships we make? So, that's always a notion of top down versus bottom up versus horizontal, right? And I think in some ways we've started, by making these networks and reaching out. And I think networks are also, I think, interesting, but can be in a way problematic, because we reach out to people we know. And how do we expand? How do we go outside the people we know? And I think that requires work. I think that requires meeting and going into spaces where we normally don't go. And I think in our increasingly polarized world, and I don't need to tell anybody the kind of threat we literally have, between Ukraine and Russia and possible war, that, we are kind of wary of going to different spaces where, people of different understandings and worldviews might be, but I think we have to make those kind of outreaches. And it's a difficult process, but I think it can be done. It just means that it takes time. And I think that's another thing, the conception of time. I'm kind of working on a piece for that for another presentation keynote that I'm doing, which is, we think time in a linear way, kind of, past, present, future, rather than cyclical way. And because, we're also part of the neoliberal project that we all critique, that, we have limits from funders, we have limits from others. And so we don't have the time that it takes, excuse me, to nurture long-term relationships. And so we sort of have to go even beyond that. So I think in terms of rethinking institutions and rethinking networks, it needs to be an underlying ongoing process. And we know this from decades of, even within the development sector, the notion of, project-based thinking versus long-term processes. And I think this eco-social contract, I think, gestures to all of that, that we're going to have to literally abandon some ways of thinking. And it's not easy, but I think that's the way. I mean, that's the only way that I see forward, to actually start building anew practices that actually are in some ways more inclusive, rather than going, to what's familiar and what we know.
And I'm going to take one more question. We've just gone to 4 questions in the Q&A, but I'm just going to take the last part of the question, which is all about, and you do raise this in your paper, that these 3 narratives, offer alternatives to the anthropocentric view. And so there's the latter part of the question that's, if you can see the Q&A, asks, in thinking about eco-social contracts, do you feel the need to diverge from liberal individualism and choose communitarian grounding to escape anthropocentrism? Or is it a false choice? And are there roots in both traditions?
Absolutely. And I think all of those communitarian imaginaries, actually, their whole ontology is relational. So the binary between the individual and the community, I think, is problematic, because in the end, both constitute each other. So the community in some ways defines what individuality and autonomy means. And, in the global North, particularly within the political liberal tradition, individual has come to, in some ways, dominate. The rights are individuals. It's only later on that we even have the notion of collective rights or group rights, particularly around indigenous communities in the 90s, even within the UN setting, right? So I think it is a false binary that both, so you cannot have one or the other, because we are, individuals in terms of our own capacities, but no one is an individual either. Whether it's genetically, familially, in terms of ancestors and history. So I think it is a false binary, but unfortunately, the dominant narratives and political theories, liberal political theories, have been about individual rights, where then the tension between the individual and communities come, which is not to say that there aren't tensions, because and I say this in the paper, that a lot of communitarian imaginaries, sometimes the communities who define them were, male dominated, or the hegemonic groups in those communities. And so marginalized groups in those communities might not have had the same voice. So it is not to romanticize communitarianism either, but to recognize that both of these are co-constituent and they cannot be sort of put in opposition to each other. Am I there? Or is everyone there? I think, Najma, you seem to have frozen on my screen at least. So I'm not sure if, okay. Yanis is saying yes, right? You're able to hear my response. Okay, great. Thank you.
It seems that, yeah, we are having technical issues with the moderator. So I would invite Luis Miguel, if you are ready to present.
Yes, well, thank you. And hello to all from Peru. Let me put my presentation on. Okay. I'm just going to start with some, wait, it's not running. Let me do it again. So, okay, let me start with some context. Well, about a bit less than 5 years ago, we had the fortune to be part of the Green Economy Coalition. And when we were confronted with the challenge of greening our economy, many ideas started to come out. But there was an actor that repeatedly came up, and these were the micro, small, medium, and enterprises. Because of their relevance to our economy, they represent about 98% of all enterprises. They contribute to 80% of the workforce, 40% of the gross domestic product, and they're a very important source of innovation. But they're also very fragile, and about only 30% of these enterprises make it through the third year. And despite the relevance and the importance to our economy, this sector is very much neglected, or it's at the bottom of the government's priorities. So we decided that we believed that we had to do something there to help them. And around that same time, we started to see that a new type of enterprise was beginning to come up in the market. And these were the green enterprises, enterprises basically run by young entrepreneurs that were incorporating into the way of doing their business in a better way, and usually contributing to solve social and environmental issues here in Peru. And then we said, okay, we have to focus our attention to these MSMEs to make sure that they have the ability to increase the survival with the aims of increasing the ratio of green MSMEs in the MSMEs universe. So we decided to empower these green MSMEs to elevate the competitiveness and resilience in the market. And we began by getting to know them. And during the next 6 months, we began to do breakfast meetings to get to know them, to learn from them, what make them go this way, how their journey was going, and what were their obstacles they were finding, or what demands did they have. And something that immediately came up was that they felt like kind of lonely, that they were struggling to make it on their own. And so we thought it was very important to create a community, and we started to foster a community to generate synergies between them, synergies with responsible consumers, synergy with people that can make them grow, also to solve common obstacles and to attract new opportunities for all. It was basically the idea of giving them a voice and making them not feel alone, that they were part of a community. And it's really when that community started to grow that the magic began to start. And as a community, we began to take public spaces and appear on marketplaces where we could show this new the new green offer on the market, and this began to draw the attention of the media, mass media, and gave us a chance to showcase the benefits of this green economy by showing real examples of this green economy that was going on here in Peru. And also as a community, we were invited to participate in events and show this new type of products, this new alternative of products. We were even invited to participate in a Green Enterprise Award in the Lima Chamber of Commerce. And the 4 final winners, top places were from our community. And also it gave us the chance to draw the attention of congressmen, politicians, and this gave us the chance to invite 5 different Congress applicants from 5 different parties to tell this community what they would do if they were elected, and also to hear from this community their needs. And I would draw the attention to this person. This is Congressman Alberto de Belaunde. He got re-elected, and he was pushing for a very important law for this community, which was the Big Enterprise Law, which stands for Collective Interest Benefit Enterprises, which is something very similar to community interest companies in the UK. And this was very important for this community because it solved 3 of the most important issues that they had, which was visibility. This law will give them a legal status that will differentiate these enterprises from the others that are not doing this, they're not creating these benefits. And also educate the consumer, because by having this big law, big label, it will make consumers understand that there are 2 types of enterprises: those that create benefits and those that are not creating the benefits. So it was very important for them also to have this big enterprise label, but also in the future it will give them access to different benefits. And one of the issues that they're having here in Peru is that it's really difficult to access the right type of financial aid. The system really doesn't work for them. So whenever we went to finance organizations to try to create some kind of softer loan for these enterprises, because of the value they create, or the reduction on costs for society that they make through their enterprises. The first question that came up to us was, but how do you define which one is green and which one is not green? And there is no such taxonomy here in Peru to define what's green. So this big label or legal status for enterprises would really solve this type of problems and probably be a start to create opportunities for these enterprises. And
Luis,
yes,
sorry, you said to interrupt you at 1 minute.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay,
just following your advice.
Okay,
hello
no,
again, everybody.
Okay, so to do it really fast, we did contact Congressman Alberto Belaunde. He told us that the B system, the B Corps here in Peru, were working close with him to see how we could get this bill passed. So we started to participate in bi-weekly meetings with the B Corps and Alberto Belaunde to see how we can create some social pressure so that the congressmen will hear about the interest of the community for this law to get passed. And we started to put information on the social media. We even draw the attention of mass media and created events to socialize the opportunity of this law. And suddenly one day, Alberto Belaunde came up to us and said, okay, I found the right moment to put this bill to discussion in the Congress, and I need signatures. So we worked through the whole weekend trying to get signatures. And at the end, we managed to get quite a lot of signatures. About 30% were from our community. And the bill was presented to Congress for discussion. And eventually on October 2020, the bill was passed and approved. And well, I guess that these are the 10 minutes, so I have to end up here. But just to wrap up everything, after this COVID came and really being part of a community, it has helped us to go through these really tough times and draw at opportunities. For instance, many digital platforms began to connect with us to see how they would incorporate this business to the digital world and so forth. So really, it was really the force of a community that made us make some changes here in Peru. We believe that we are at the start of something that can get bigger, and we're looking forward to see how we can draw the force of this community to make some changes here in Peru.
Thank you so much, Luis Miguel. Thank you. And my apologies to everyone for the disappearing act. That was completely unintentional. And thank you to the colleagues who filled in for me. And Luis Miguel, I mean, I've heard the story of Peru before, and it's a different community. You know, it's a different sort of force that was created between this alliance of enterprises and finding, you know, friends in unusual spaces. And I think, you know, as I hand over to Yannis, I think we're going to hear a very different way in which the policy and the regulation system was harnessed, and a different, you know, way of collecting signatures, I guess, Yannis. But over to you to hear your story from Germany, and feel free to share your screen and your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. Just 1 second. Yeah, there we go. As you've already introduced me, my name is Yannis. I'm 20 years old and I'm a climate activist and law student from Germany. I study at the University of Bonn. And I think I will focus mostly on the eco side of the eco-social contract, more specifically on climate and on the role that the climate movement, Fridays for Future, played in Germany for the past years. And now there's a new trend of climate litigation joining it. First of all, I'm aware that Germany likes to portray itself as climate frontrunner, and I want to make sure that this is not true. So I want to make sure that you know that this is not true. On the left-hand side, unfortunately, it's in German. We can see the green path indicating the Paris Agreement's goals to reach net zero, and the red path is the government's goal to reach net zero. And as you can see, those two graphs are not in line. So the government plans to reach net zero about 10 years too late to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And moreover, on the right-hand side, you can see the German Minister for Economy and Climate. And he also shows a graph, and the red path shows, again, the government's goal, net zero by 2045. And then we're in black, the measures that are already in place and have been adopted by the government to achieve this goal. And as you can see, the measures are not even enough to reach the government's own climate goal, which is even not enough to reach the Paris Agreement. So we have lots of things ahead to do. And this is also why there's the climate movement, Fridays for Future in Germany. I've been part of this since basically its beginning. And we spent now more than 3 years protesting and organizing demonstrations. On the left picture, you can see the global strike in September 2019, which was the biggest so far, at least in Germany. And we also talked to politicians. On the right-hand side, you can see a member of parliament from our district. Yes, and this climate movement really started a momentum in Germany to take climate action seriously. Ah, yeah, that's actually me in the picture. But now, and yes, and another thing we achieved was in our hometown, which you've already mentioned in the introduction, was that Konstanz was the first city to declare the climate emergency for Konstanz. But this does not have changed anything about the fact that Germany still misses its climate goals. And this is why we can now observe a new trend in Germany, which is climate litigation. So basically taking climate action in front of courts. And I think most important in this context is to be aware of the fact that climate litigation always has an international dimension. The most famous climate cases probably come from the Netherlands and are already years old. And now we see a rapidly increasing number of climate cases also in Germany and also around the world. And I believe the most important factors driving these climate litigation cases are at first climate science, who gives us the scientific insights into what happens with our climate. And this is going to be important in front of courts to give proof. And secondly, climate protests, because without these protests, courts would not dare to take such important decisions, actually. And then in Germany, we had last year, pretty much a year ago, a very important decision by the German Federal Constitutional Court. And it ruled that the German government was not doing enough in terms of climate action. And it focused that intergenerational justice, as well as the international dimension of climate action, both play a major role in taking climate action for Germany. This was then how the decision looked like finally. And after this first decision in Germany, we saw some other cases developing. First of all, and I was also part of this, we tried to copy the German federal decisions, the German federal court's decision onto the state level in Germany. Germany is a federal republic, so the states have to play a major role in fighting climate change. And we tried to copy this on state level. It was just weeks ago dismissed, unfortunately. And also we see now lawsuits emerging against major carbon polluter, major climate polluters such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen. I guess you know them. And we also see a second constitutional complaint against, again, the Federal Climate Protection Act in Germany, which was only filed some weeks ago. And maybe some of you have heard about it. There's still a case pending in Germany from a Peruvian farmer suing the German energy producer RWE for compensation for loss and damages and threats that are posed to him due to increasing climate change. Then I was also asked to tell you something about my personal motivation to be, first of all, a part of climate movement and Fridays for Future, and then one of the claimants in the constitutional complaint against my state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. I need to say that I'm deeply disappointed by the German government. As I've said, Fridays for Future has been protesting for more than 3 years now, and we already know what we're doing to our climate for more than 50 years, I would say. And that's why I'm deeply disappointed that the politicians do not seem willing to change anything about the fact that we are actually destroying our future, the future of our younger generations. And this is also why I became a claimant in the constitutional complaint against State Climate Protection Act in Germany. And recently, and I think this goes for most of the German climate movement, we shift our hopes from the politicians towards the judges, because politicians have proved to be unwilling or maybe unable to change anything about the fact that we are destroying our climate. And that's why we now put on our hopes more increasingly onto judges to change anything, to change that. And we're going to see if this is going to be enough. Yes, finally, some more remarks. I believe that both climate protests and litigation has to be seen as contributors to the new eco-social contract, and they can also be seen as drivers to implement this contract. And to come back to the social dimension of the eco-social contract, I am sure that the German climate movement, as well as the international climate movement, is well aware of the social dimension of climate action, both nationally and internationally, while at the same time, I'm not so sure about German courts, at least. I wouldn't bet on them considering the social dimension of climate action. I think they do care most about their state, actually. But I believe that that courts can actually play a big role in international climate action. And this is also what I hope, that courts will make up for what the politicians have disappointed us with in terms of climate action. Thank you very much. I hope there is still some minutes left for the discussion, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions.
Thank you, Janus, and it would be great. I mean, if I think we would share presentations afterwards, but also if you don't mind, also to share the details of Friday for Futures for anyone who wants to get in contact with you. So I was thinking, as you were speaking, it must be wonderful to see as a law student that you are not only studying in the classroom, but beginning to see the application of law in society. I'm sure that's something that I think many of us who are interested in the area of education and what education should mean in society. I mean, I think it's an inspiring story, Janus, to hear you as someone who's studying the law, but also beginning to look at the application of the law, in the country. So there's lots of questions here, but there's one. I'm going to put one for you and one for Louise, because we really have, pressed for time. I feel we're at the time of our conversation where we want to get a cup of coffee and sit back and now really talk. And we've got 6 minutes left on our webinar and a meeting right after. But I think here's a question here, Janus, that I would really love to hear your perspective on. And it's from Carlos. And he asks, what can be a reason for the systematic failure of basically all countries to fulfill the goals of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, that's actually what I've been wondering about for 3 years now. I have no clue what could drive them to not take climate action. I believe, and this is also something that the German Federal Constitutional Court highlighted, is the intertemporal dimension of climate change and climate action. So we do have to take action now to prevent bad things from happening in the very far future and for our children. And I believe that maybe in national politics, short term plays a bigger role, and short term profits from economy. And I believe that's why it's so important to have someone who looks at in the long term, actually, and reminds us of taking action of things that we can do only now, and then will become and then will have irreversible consequences if we don't do them now.
I think that's a wonderful response, Janus, and I think nobody better to look forward than someone who's in a 20-year-old, pair of shoes. So I think, many of us who've been fighting this fight for decades now really are taking inspiration from your courage and bravery, and the fact that you are, putting sometimes yourselves, on the line to take action and to act, from your place of conviction, and to really call governments, to account. It's our vote matters. When we are putting our trust in governments to keep us safe and secure, it's also about, giving us a safe and secure future. And so many young activists and protesters and thinkers, I would say, like yourself, are exactly, what we need at this moment. And thank you so much for your response. There's a question for you, Luis Miguel, which I hope we can still get to. And it's really also to thank you for the inspiring story from Peru. And for me, I'm very lucky to have had as part of the Green Economy Coalition, hearing the story from Peru quite a few times. So, Miguel, the question to you is really, to what extent are micro entrepreneurs involved in the Economia Verde network, and also to what extent do the bottom of the income distribution or less educated entrepreneurs have an opportunity to get involved in this network? And we obviously know that MSMEs, micro and small medium enterprises of various sizes. And just, I think, in maybe 1 minute, Luis, please, a little bit more about the network.
That's a really good question. There is actually a different type of intervention between the bigger or smaller enterprises. Basically, well, in this community, they all have the same chance to participate, and we invite everyone to participate in all the events that we do. But what we have found is that the smaller the enterprise are, the less time they have available to participate. These are really small businesses that they can't afford to leave their work or their business for a long period of time without connecting with their consumers. So we're trying to see how we can manage to solve that type of problems to make sure that everyone takes part of this community. But we have found the difference between bigger and smaller enterprises.
Thank you so much, Luis. And so for me, it is really hard to close off this webinar, because I feel, as I said to Janus, now's the time I want to get a cup of coffee, and I want to really, we've got 12 questions that we need to respond to. We will try and do that in some way. Manisha, I know that the paper is going to land in the public space at some time, so watch the space. Those of you who are part of the Research and Action Network for an Eco-Social Contract, we're not only wanting to stimulate the thought around this, but we want the stories, the actions, the kind of actions that young people are taking, that entrepreneurs are taking, that mining communities in South Africa are taking. We want to find out where citizens are beginning to hold their governments to account and asking them, to build a safe, socially just and ecologically just future together. And so I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much for your inspiring thoughts and stories with us today. This is the first of many, we hope. And we invite you to visit both the GEC and UNRWA's websites to find out more about the Global Research and Action Network and to join our community. We'd greatly appreciate if you complete the very short feedback, which I'm sure will ask us for more time to discuss. And I wish you all a wonderful day further. And in terms of the questions, we will try and get to them. And in our write-up, perhaps, of this webinar, we try and bring some of the panelists' reflections into that. Thank you so much to Manisha, Janus, and Luis Miguel, and to all of you, the audience, for joining us here today. It was lovely being with you.